Welcome everyone. We will get started here in just a couple of minutes as we're letting folks in. Well, good afternoon. We're going to get started. Wanted to say thanks for being here. It's Tuesday, which means it's another edition of one of our Launch Nebraska webinars, and going to dig in this week to talk about supporting students with disabilities today, and then supporting English learners on Thursday. So we're glad you're here and appreciate you taking the time to join us today. I did just want to start off with acknowledging the current situation that we're experiencing in our state and in our country, and but also recognizing that it's not something new, that as we think about the world that we live in, and we know that what we're seeing is just a manifestation of many years of frustration and systemic oppression and disfranchisement and marginalization for our African American brothers and sisters. And I think that if anything, it's highlighted the need for us to not just call out equity, but also be more targeted and intentional about addressing inequities. So we certainly are thinking about our educators that are trying to navigate conversations around race and justice with their schools and with their families and with their communities. And so I think we also recognize that we have a lot of work to do, not only in our country, but within our state. We at the NDE are committed to continuing those conversations and elevating the work around inequity. So with that, it is very appropriate that we are kicking off today's webinar specifically around supporting students with disabilities. I do want to just acknowledge that we have the recordings, the slides, tools, and templates from last week, which was around unfinished learning and literacy. I had a lot of emails around the resource for literacy tools and strategies that I know that Julia shared, so that's up there. Take a look at that. You can download it. All the links are in there. And we have and do continue to release additional resources on Launch Nebraska. If you're new to the webinar series, it's launchne.com. And just about a week ago, we put up guidance for summer learning, specifically related to health. So we're getting a lot of questions around the health considerations, but also additional guidance for what summer school or summer learning might look like, even though we're already into June, but then also additional guidance for supporting students with disabilities. So be sure to check out launchnebraska.com. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Those resources are available to you. And as always, I'm just going to invite you to continue the conversation on Twitter and use the hashtag LaunchNebraska. And just a reminder, this is webinar 6. Oh my gosh, it's hard to believe that we're already into June, webinar 6. We have 10 in total. But our goal with the series, and I think we are doing a really great job in meeting the goal of providing clear and actionable information that's aligned with continuity of learning plans for districts and systems. And our conversations over the last few weeks have been about summer learning, but I think we're starting to pivot a little bit and thinking more about what the next school year might look like as well. I'm excited to introduce Allie with SchoolKit. We're so thankful that SchoolKit has partnered with us in this efforts. They've worked in Nebraska for a couple of years now. If you went to the Nebraska MTSS Summit last year, you might have got to hear Ethan there, as well as in our Strengthen the Core. But Allie, we're excited to have you with us today. Thanks for being here with our educators.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Corey, and thank you each of you for being here. I am excited to get to talk to you today. As Corey said, my name is Allie, and I'm going to talk to you about supporting students with disabilities this summer, but also beyond. I'm currently based out of Philadelphia, where I work as an assistant professor supporting graduate students who are pursuing their master's in special education. You can see some of those on the screen. I'm also a former reading and special educator, and I started my career 14 years ago in Seattle. But right now, what I'm trying to do is hone my reading teacher skills as I'm attempting to teach my almost 5-year-old boys to read while entertaining my 2-year-old during the process. So thanks again for being with me this evening. As we begin the webinar, I want to just remind you of some norms as we engage tonight. If you've been on previous webinars, these aren't new to you, but I wanted to go through them quickly in case you are new. Due to the nature of this format, I'm going to be doing a lot of the talking, but I'll also ask you to review and reflect on some materials. First, I want to name that this is a webinar and we could experience technical difficulties. So thank you for your patience as we figure those out together. You're welcome to use the Q&A feature if you have questions about tech or logistics. Another thing to consider is that if you go to view options and exit full screen, it will better allow you to see your chat box. During the session, Anders is going to be providing some links that you will engage with throughout the session. And finally, as Corey stated, this session will be available at www.launchne.com. So in addition to all of those things, we are going to ask you to engage in some ways, and we'll be asking you to use the chat feature a few times throughout this webinar. And again, if you have questions, you can use that QA box. So take a moment and look to see how we'll be spending our time this evening. All right, so let's go ahead and get started by grounding ourselves in the data and identifying the current challenge. Then we'll identify the implications of this challenge on systems, schools, and then the folks we care about most, our students. So let's go ahead and begin. Although you're probably pretty familiar with this statement, it's always important to start here. This was guidance from the Department of Education around serving students with disabilities. And the guidance states that even with the particular climate, it should not prevent any school from offering educational programs through distance learning. So we know this is great news. It means that our students will still receive their specialized instruction, no matter the context. But we also know that this new type of learning comes with many challenges, so we'll get into those in just a moment. I also want to make sure that we are connecting our learning today to the state of Nebraska's philosophy, as well as the different networks. So the guidance from the Office of Special Education in Nebraska does focus on this framework of differentiated support, as well as the multi-tiered system of support, which promotes an integrated system, making sure to connect general and special education into a high quality standards-based instruction and intervention framework. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to focus on this aspect of differentiated support, which again connects to Nebraska's philosophy, as well as the multi-tiered system of support. So as we launch into this work today, go ahead and review some of the challenges we're facing. You can read them on the screen to yourself. So we all are very familiar that we've missed the last 3 months of learning, and we're still all honing our skills in terms of virtual or distance learning, as well as trying to ensure that we are complying to assess students and write their IEPs. So these are big challenges, and they're unprecedented challenges. And we want to make sure that our students with disabilities get what they need during this time. The impacts of these challenges are widespread. If you tuned in for other webinars, you've likely seen this data, so I'm just going to review it quickly. NWEA, which are the creators of the map, shared this in regards to unfinished learning. We saw that recent COVID slide estimates are predicting that students may return to school next year with a learning loss of at least 30% in ELA and 50% in math compared to a typical school year. Well, what does this mean for student learning? It means it could derail the futures of students who were previously on grade level and would be disastrous for students who were left behind. So if that data represents typical learning loss, we have to ask this question. What might our students with disabilities experience? So we are going to start to answer that question today by grounding our learning and thinking about what works. Many of us have already reviewed the findings of the opportunity myth together in previous conversations, so I won't bemoan the point here, but as you know, this study sheds some light on ways we can support all of our students, especially those who come into the year far behind. So let's go ahead and briefly review the outcomes of this study. First of all, we know that all students need and deserve consistent access to grade level content. We also know those materials have to be high quality instructional materials. And finally, we need teachers like you who have high expectations and believe their students can meet grade level standards. All right, so let's go ahead and just zoom in on two of these key points. When we think about the impact of high expectations, how much can students grow when they have a teacher with them? Well, all students grouped together grew 4.6 months compared to teachers who did not have high expectations. But what happened when we looked at students who started the year significantly below their peers? They grew 7.9 months compared to students who did not have teachers with high expectations. So that's a big deal. When we think of grade level materials, all students who were grouped together grew 1.7 months compared to those who did not have grade level materials. But students who were behind grew 7.3 months. So we have to keep this in mind as we talk about how to best support our students with disabilities. So this is going to be our focus for the next hour or so. And I'm just going to go ahead and read that question to you. How can we best support students with high incidence disabilities to access and succeed with grade level content in the current climate and beyond? Since we only have an hour today, we are going to be focusing this webinar on students with high incidence disabilities and how to mitigate unfinished learning through access to grade level text or grade level content. Please note that if you teach low incidence disabilities and autism classroom, that there is a framework that we're going to go through today that you can apply to your practice, but I will also share additional resources at the end of the webinar for you to think more specifically about your students. All right, so let's go ahead and get started and take it into the classroom. All right, so now that we've reminded ourselves of the importance of engaging all students with grade level text, let's think about systems that support this type of instruction. So we're gonna read about two schools, Cowan Elementary and Greenbrier Elementary, to see what summer actions they take to schedule and plan for fall instruction. So as you read, I want you to consider this question. What do you notice about how each school plans to meet the academic needs of its students with disabilities? And what do you wonder? Anders is going to go ahead and chat the link to this document. As you can see, he has in the chat box. And again, if you can't find your chat box, feel free to go ahead and minimize your screen, exit full view, and then your chat box should be right there. So we're going to take about 4 minutes to allow you to read about these two schools, and then I'm going to ask you to share your thinking. So I'll stop talking and give you 4 minutes. So we're going to come on back in about 20 seconds. Hopefully you had time to read both studies, both schools. All right, so as you're wrapping up, I'd love to hear from you. Go ahead and find your chat box and tell me, which school better ensures that students with disabilities are receiving access to grade level instruction? And how do you know? Take a moment or two to reflect on this question in the chat box. I'm seeing Bethany tells us about the use of data at Greenbrier, that they're using formative assessment data. They're thinking about the intervention plans based on student need. At Greenbrier also, they're putting all students in core instruction. There's collaboration between the teachers at Greenbrier. That seems to be sticking out as a trend here, that at Greenbrier, they didn't pull students from the core, and they provided a support by collaborative instruction. At Greenbrier, again, there's more planning. Wait for a couple more responses here. I'm seeing Greenbrier period, right? They're using more current assessment data, right? Multiple data points there. At Greenbrier, again, all students were considered. Students were placed in groups according to needs. And then there was this clear effort of collaboration and team planning, thinking about all of the stakeholders involved. Thank you so much for your thoughts here. So I was thinking very similarly. So as we take a closer look at the schools, many of you were noticing the discrepancies between the systems that the schools were using to schedule and place students. So let's go ahead and look at these two schools in tandem. While at Cowan, not all students received access to the core, in Greenbrier, all the students did. At Cowan, they used old math data to place students. And that was the only thing that they used to take students out of the core and place them into an intervention. At Greenbrier, there were multiple data points that were used to not only place students into additional interventions, but also identify trends so that they could be supported within the core, excuse me. At Cowan, the teachers who were teaching special education received particular training only for their particular intervention, while at Greenbrier, the special educators received core training as well as training in their intervention. And finally, as you identified, at Cowan, there was kind of a lack of collaboration. Each teacher kind of existed in their silo, while at Greenbrier, there was a clear plan for that continuous collaboration. So each of you named these key points here. So we just got the opportunity to look at hypothetical elementary schools, right? Like the ideal. But we know that right now there's a lot of things that aren't ideal. So what we're going to do is we're going to call out some of these systems and structures that we can all do to get closer to that ideal, okay? And later on, you're going to have the opportunity to identify your next steps. So what does this mean for your work? So in order to ensure that students are placed into classes where they can access grade level text, there's three big buckets we can't consider because just scheduling them clearly is not enough, right? So bucket number one is thinking strategically about scheduling. Bucket number two is professional development and collaboration. And then we have bucket number three, identifying what is challenging and planning accordingly to ensure students are supported in the core. As you may notice, these buckets start at the systems level, then move to the school level, and finally it lands us in the classroom with the students. And this is also this perspective we are going to take as we go through our session today. So let's go ahead and start by thinking about bucket one, scheduling, that systems level. All right, so as we think about what we learned from the opportunity myth, we remind ourselves that inclusive education really means that our students have access to grade level instruction. Therefore, all students with disabilities should receive access to grade level core instruction. Second, we know that all students, not just students with disabilities, will face barriers within the classroom. So our second key point is that teachers should use data to offer differentiated supports within the classroom to ensure that they align with students' areas of need. Third, when we think about intervention, we know that our students, this is something they need. It's not to say we put them in core and support them a little and they'll be fine. That's not specialized instruction, right? That's just where we're starting today. So students will need intervention, but it should not replace core instruction. It should support and exist in addition to core instruction. Finally, we have to know if we're doing this right. So we're going to use formative assessment, diagnostic assessments to think about where students are growing and what they need in addition to, in order to progress, monitor, and adjust accordingly. All right, so the case study also shed light on a little bit of bucket 2, professional development and collaboration. So let's go ahead and talk about bucket number 2. When we think about these case studies, it better helps us understand what these instances of PD can look like. First, it's paramount to train both general and special education teachers on that high quality core curriculum or instructional materials. This might look like a week-long summer PD to unpack Unit 1, identify what's tricky about students, and then continue to look and work towards the year at those places that could be barriers for students. So that this work is ongoing. We have to make sure that general education and special educators are in the same room talking about core instruction, because special educators know a lot. They know where their students might struggle. And so it's a really important voice in this conversation. Then we have to think about a plan. What happens next? During an in-person class, there might be opportunities to group students strategically that have similar kinds of needs, and then provide inclusion or push-in support. So that's one example. There could be 100 different ways you could do this. But I also want to call out that this can also be done through distance learning. Here is one example. You might have core instruction occurring during the AM. And then those same kind of supports that the special education teacher was going to offer in person might be supported in the afternoon. So again, everything that we talk about tonight should be able to be replicated during distance learning. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start thinking about what does this look like for our students. And to do that, we move on to bucket number 3. We have to be able to identify the barriers and challenges that are in the classroom and within the instructional materials, in which students might struggle to access and succeed with that grade level content. So this is where a shared framework comes in handy. When we discuss our students' strengths and needs, we'll use our experience, our education, our current context, all these different things to describe them. However, other folks might use different experiences, different contexts. So it's really helpful to have a standardized framework to consider and norm the strengths and the challenges for our students. So that way we can work on norming the barriers that are existing, and then we can think through aligned strategies to break them down. So today we'll get the opportunity to dig into a framework that helps us do just that. Speak the same language when discussing our students' strengths and our students' needs. That way, we're aligned in choosing a support that eliminates that need. So I'd love to hear from you. We're going to talk about universal design for learning, and I want to hear, what do you know about it? So in the chat, or I guess it's not in the chat, on your screen, a UDL poll is going to pop up. So I'd like you to go ahead and choose what's your level of familiarity with this framework. You've never heard of it, you've heard of it, but you're not sure how to explain it, you're familiar with the key components, or you use it in your planning and instruction. So take a moment and fill out where you land on this framework. All right, I'll give you about 10 more seconds to identify where you land. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and close that poll. All right, so sharing the results of this poll, about 30% of you have not heard about it. 34% of you you've heard of it, but you're not quite sure how to explain it. 28 of you are like, I'm familiar with these components, and 7% of you feel pretty confident in using it in your planning instruction. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with me. So my hope is that by the end of today's webinar, you will be able to tell someone about these 3 components in a way that feels simple and one that you could apply to your classroom and continued collaboration. All right, so before I talk about the frameworks, what I do want to mention is that this is important to better understand how to break down those barriers with our core curriculum. Just providing access is not enough. They're in the core, they're good. We also have to identify what is challenging a student and what challenges they may face to better support them. This is a way for us to ensure we are providing true inclusive instruction. And we might even be able to use a student's IEP to predict what barriers they may face and plan accordingly. So let's go ahead and talk about these key components in the universal design for learning. Before I do that, I want to let you know that the labels they use for these components often change. The CAST Institute has created this framework based on brain research. We're not going to go deep into this today, but we will provide you with additional resources to explore. So today I've kind of boiled this framework down to its component parts for you. All right, so the first component is engagement. Here you're trying to answer the question, how can I motivate students and stimulate their interest in the topics? So if engagement is a barrier, we have to figure out strategies for motivation. The second bucket is understanding. How can I support students to better understand the content being taught? And the third component is expression. How can I ensure my students can demonstrate what they know and what they've learned through multiple formats? So I'm just going to leave that up there for about 20 seconds so you can reread those 3 components and have them in your head as we go through a process coming up. Okay, so in thinking about this framework, we have to use it strategically. So we're going to go through a process for supporting all students, especially our students with disabilities, to enable them to access and be successful with grade level content. And we're going to take this process. First, we'll identify the barriers in the upcoming unit or lesson. Second, we'll plan aligned supports. And third, we'll implement those supports, collect data, and figure out if they're working. So let's go ahead and start with identifying the barriers. To do that, we are going to step into Miss Yardley's class. She is a teacher at Greenbrier Elementary. She is currently starting her grade 4 expeditionary learning unit in ELA that analyzes and determines themes of poems. As part of this unit, students have to read the following poem, which I'm going to read to you. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep. And miles to go before I sleep. And miles to go before I sleep. So this is the poem she is going to introduce to her students. I want you to take a moment, find your chat box, and consider, based on these 3 buckets, knowing that we didn't go deep into this framework, What do you think might be barriers related to engagement, understanding, or expression during this lesson? I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to chat your response. And if you can, identify if they would be pegged to engagement, understanding, or expression. I see that there might be a barrier to understanding and structure. There might be a barrier to understanding in terms of vocabulary. A student might not like poetry, which is related to engagement. Thank you, Vanessa. The reading comprehension of the poem would be related to understanding. Again, these tricky vocabulary words like harness and downy. The topic, students might not be interested in the topic related to engagement, a difficulty with understanding related to difficult words and phrases, that structure of the poem. They may not understand the layout. Engagement in terms of the students might see this as a seasonal poem due to the title, so that background knowledge. Yeah, so like Ellen talks about knowing what the woods are. So again, that student's background knowledge. There's abstract thinking in here. All really, really, really good ideas. Again, a barrier to understanding might be actually decoding the poem for a student who might have needs in word recognition. Claudia tells us that when the student is expressing the poem, they might have difficulty expressing the meaning because of a barrier in vocabulary. Amanda tells us that, again, with expression, explaining how literary devices here could be tricky. All of these things. Yeah, all right. Thank you so much for your thoughts. So I found the same things as you here. So I found all of these engagement challenges. Just take a moment and read these to yourself. They're very similar to what you identified. Go ahead and read about the barriers that a student might face in understanding. Again, very similar to what you all identified. And I should have added a structure up there. Absolutely, that's a challenge in understanding. And finally, we're going to go ahead and move on to expression, and you can read this screen to yourself as well. So there's so many different barriers that students could face in any given lesson, right? This is just one component of a lesson. So we've got a lot to choose from, and we're going to think about which ones we choose and why in just a moment. So now that we've identified our barrier, it's time for us to plan aligned supports. Now, it's important to know that we can't possibly eliminate every single barrier, and we don't want to. That essentially steals the thinking from our students. We want them to struggle a little bit. So we're going to take a look at all the possibilities, and then we'll think about the supports that Miss Yardley actually put in place. So as we do this, continue to consider what you might prioritize for your students in your classroom. So when we think about aligned supports for engagement, we might activate background knowledge by asking students what they already know about poetry, and that brings their relevant experience to the foreground. This is also an aspect of culturally responsive teaching. We might read the text aloud so they don't have to worry about reading it all on their own, and it also might pique their interest. So those are some supports we could provide in engagement. Now let's think about understanding. We might build student knowledge by asking scaffolded text-dependent questions. We also might do them about a particular passage. So we might chunk that text and only zoom in on one stanza at a time. We might read this poem a bunch of different times to support the understanding. And finally, you all identified that there's a lot of tricky vocabulary words. So we might want to provide either pre-teaching or drop-in definitions to ensure that those words themselves don't throw the students completely off. Now let's move on to expression. So in thinking about expression, we might provide alternate opportunities to demonstrate what they know. Maybe we ask them to share orally, or we do a turn and talk before they share out, before we actually ask them to get their ideas down on paper. We also might support their oral reading fluency by reading the text a few times, or reading it to a partner. And finally, we want to plan engagement opportunities to actually get students to try out their ideas by engaging in turn-in talks before sharing with the whole group. So this list is not endless. We could have a gazillion different supports for each of these buckets, but these are just some that are aligned to the barriers that we identified. All right, so now that we've considered all these barriers, let's go back and think about how Miss Yardley may plan to support these students. So to do that, we are going to go back into her classroom, knowing that she can't do all of these things and she doesn't want to do all of these things. She has to choose the ones that are best suited for this lesson and for her students. So now you have the opportunity to meet Laurie. She is a student in Miss Yardley's class, and she has a specific learning disability in reading fluency and reading comprehension. So you're going to get the opportunity to read about her experience in Miss Yardley's class. And then you can chat your response. What scaffolds does Miss Yardley provide to all students? And what scaffolds does Miss Yardley provide specifically to Laurie to support her needs in fluency and comprehension? I just spoke a lot, so feel free to use the screen to support you as you read about Laurie's experience. In a moment, Anders is going to go ahead and provide that tiny URL in the chat for you. All right, there it is. I'll give you about 4 minutes of reading time, and feel free as you read to go ahead and chat your response to these questions. I'll give you another minute of reading time, and then I'm going to go ahead and read some of the responses that we've had to these two focus questions. Great. So a lot of you have been able to respond to that first question. What scaffold does Miss Yardley provide for all students? If you haven't gotten the chance to respond to the second one, go ahead and do that now. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share out some of the great responses I'm seeing. So I'm seeing that Miss Yardley is activating when the support she's providing for all students. She's activating prior learning. She's reading the story out loud. She's playing a four corners game to get them to start to activate their knowledge about poetry. She is supporting their vocabulary through the read aloud. She has partner supports in place. She is breaking down the poem, zooming in on chunks, particularly asking students to use text evidence in their responses. So she's doing all of those things, and that is what I found as well. All right, so when in supporting all students, she is providing multiple readings of the text. She is zooming in to particular stanzas and asking them to answer text-dependent questions. She's providing students to engage with each other to deepen their understanding. And then she is supporting them with definitions of tricky vocabulary words. So now let's go ahead and zoom in on what she's doing for Laurie, knowing that all of these strategies that she is providing exist in one of these buckets: engagement, understanding, or expression. When we think about Laurie, I'm going to start teasing them out. But before I share those, I want to identify what you wrote about how she is supporting Laurie. You're saying that she is asking Laurie to whisper read, which is supporting her expression. She's also providing differentiated vocabulary support. She's providing, she's asking Laurie to reread, and she's giving her feedback on her fluency, and then she's reinforcing the definitions, harass and harness, which Laurie confused. She is refocusing the student with a more particular question, and she's asking scaffolded questions that increase in rigor so that Laurie can build her understanding to that focus question. All wonderful responses. Thank you so much for thinking through the supports that Ms. Yardley is providing first to all students, how she's using this framework for all, and then zooming in on Laurie. So again, let's just take another look here about specifically what is she doing across each of these buckets. So the supports for understanding kind of tap into Laurie's need in comprehension. She's providing that additional read aloud of stanza 1 for Laurie to hear it one more time. She's also asking those text-dependent questions, which you identified, and she's providing that additional vocabulary support. So just what you noticed. And when we think about expression or Laurie's ability to demonstrate this knowledge, she's providing the opportunity to answer orally before writing down. She's providing scaffolded turn-in talks with a partner that focus on text-dependent questions. before Laurie is asked to share out with the group. And indeed, she is doing this fluency check-in with feedback, which many of you identified. So this is, again, ideal. She's doing so much at once. And one thing I do want you to remember that is impossible to implement all of this at once. Instead, you would think of the key levers for your class, for your student, and what's feasible. If you are providing inclusion support, what might you do with specific students with disabilities while the general ed teacher is doing something else? Or what support might the general education teacher provide to all, because they would all benefit from it? You have to make sure that you're prioritizing those strategies that best allow your students to access and be successful with the grade level content, but you don't want to provide all the supports in the world or steal the learning from them. So now that we've thought about this framework, knowing that we just kind of went surface level with this, let's think about the current context we are in. What are the implications for distance learning, and how can we plan for these types of supports now? So here is a little bit of guidance for you. You can continue that common planning time for both general or special education teachers to identify those barriers. You might do a collaborative unit study by reading the text together, doing the math problems together, evaluating the end of unit tasks, and then thinking, ooh, what was tricky in that? What was I not engaged with? What didn't I understand? What was tricky about expressing my learning? And then norming on those together and identifying whole group supports and individualized supports. And this can happen via phone or via Zoom. And then you'd think, great, where do we want to start? What barriers do we want to tackle first to ensure students are accessing this text? And what will that look like? Another implication for distance learning is that we can leverage technology here. We might assign Zoom breakout groups, if you're using Zoom while you're teaching, to ask students to strategically join a group that might need the most help, or push students who don't need any help into breakout groups and leave the students who have lingering questions in the main room. You might also provide pre-recorded versions of the text. You can just record via Zoom. Maybe I would read that text aloud, record it, and then send it to my students so they can practice reading that text fluently with that pre-recording. And you might also consider, what does this look like? Can I provide this type of instruction by phone for students who might not have access? Or can I do a conference call with a couple of students at one time? So lots of different ways to think about how this work could then be translated to distance learning. Finally, I want to acknowledge that the example we used today focused on ELA. So take a moment and look at what UDL might look like in math, knowing that we're going to provide you with a one-pager that has all this information on it. But I don't want to forget about you. So take about 30 seconds to yourself and you can review this slide on your own. All right, so again, this is coming your way in a minute in a big resource packet. So I've done a lot of talking, you've likely done a lot of thinking, and now we're going to spend just a few minutes thinking about next steps. So Anders is going to populate a tiny URL link into the chat, and this just reviews the process we went through today. So I'm going to give you a minute to go ahead and review this document and then reflect. What is your next step over the summer? So we'll come on back in 2 minutes, again thinking, what is your next step to implement this learning? I know I only gave you a minute, but I'm seeing some really wonderful responses in the chat. And I see that some of you are focused more on like the school level and those students that we care the most about. And then some of us are thinking more broadly at a systems level. Diane reminds us that intervention doesn't replace core instruction, right? That might be a shift in thinking here. And then we have to identify plans for core instruction. We have to ensure a training exists for both general and special educators together and identify co-planning time. So some of these action steps do require that element of collaboration with other teachers, with other leaders, and possibly in the with the special education director. So it's really exciting to see all the things that you are planning on doing. So as we close out today, I want to make sure I'm sharing a bunch of different resources with you, some of which Corey named at the top of tonight's session. So here are 2 Nebraska-specific resources. The first is Launch Nebraska, the learning guidance for students with disabilities. Likely you have been familiar with this before, but it provides guidance related to this unfinished learning, the extended school year, and compensatory education and services with students with disabilities. We also have the multi-tiered system of support document, which will be coming up pretty shortly and will help us walk through the problem-solving process as a means to utilize the student assistance team. There's 2 other resources to share with you here. One is Supporting Students with Disabilities UDL strategy sheet. So that will walk through what planning for ELA and math might look like as you do this work and continue to engage with it. And the other is a technical assistance document. So as you are thinking about students who may or may not have access, what might you do specifically with students with disabilities? And all of those resources live in this tiny URL resource hub. So there's a document that has a whole bunch of different hyperlinks, as well as some of these documents that are PDF form that exist in this document. And we're going to share this with you after the webinar in just a few minutes. I also want to say it has been such an honor to work with you during this very difficult time. I want you to know how much I appreciate each of your leadership and dedication to your students and your schools and your families. Thank you for being here, and thank you for what you do. Here's the link. Oh.
I'm sorry, Allie, I was going to jump in and say that we are going to put the link to the survey in the chat box. And as we get close to the half hour, I did want to acknowledge, and I've shared this previously, so over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be working to highlight some resources that will help you identify essential content for literacy and mathematics for the upcoming school year. So it's not prioritizing standards, but what it is really drilling down to the most essential content for literacy and mathematics just based on what we know about what the fall might look like, or the interruptions that may exist. The other thing too I just wanted to reference is that really mid to late July, we're going to have more Nebraska specific academic guidance that will be coming out around core content and some considerations for assessment, instructional materials, and professional learning. One thing that was really reiterated today, and we've been reiterating this for quite some time now, is that access to strong core instruction is what's most critical in all of our conversations around teaching and learning. And we know that our students with disabilities can reach grade level content, and we should have high expectations for all of our learners. So I'm thankful to Amy Rohn and our Director of Special Education and the Nebraska MTSS team. I think we've had a consistent message around strong core instruction for all, and Allie, thanks for reiterating that to us today. On Thursday, we'll continue our conversation around supporting students, and specifically we're going to talk about supporting English learners. So you'll want to be sure to join us if you're able to. And then next week we'll also start to talk a little bit more about assessment and what that might look like as we approach the start of the fall year. So all of our resources and the recordings for the webinars will be on our Launch Nebraska site. I know folks are anxious to get those, so our hope would be to get those up over the next day or so. With that, we're going to end for today. Thanks for being here, and as always, if you have questions or have ideas, let us know. And if you can take just a couple seconds to give us some feedback on the survey, that would be appreciated. Have a great evening. We'll see you Thursday.